So my name is Boaz Arad, and I'm managing the Ayn Rand Center in Israel. And it's wonderful to have all you here among us, and we are actually enlarging the circles of communication, partnership, discussion through international boundaries and time and space, and this is one of the little upside of the whole situation. And I will pass the baton to Tal Heinrich from New York, and she will lead the meeting. If anyone have a question, you may raise hand or may send a private request to me on chat, and I'll try to deliver it to Tal or open the mic for you if you need. And of course, Johan, it's up to you when to open the mics to people or not. So I'll keep now admitting people through the door. We'll try to do it quietly from the back rows and not passing. and we'll start. So Tal, please take the lead.
All right, welcome everyone. Sweden's coronavirus strategy. Welcome, I'm Tal Heinrich here in New York, and this is Zoom to Freedom. I'm a news anchor, I'm a contributor for Quick Hits, and today I will be hosting this conversation on behalf of the Ayn Rand Center in Israel and the Israeli Freedom Movement. Our guest today is Johan Norberg. He's joining us from Stockholm, Sweden. Johan is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute. He's a Swedish author and a historian of ideas. Johan writes about globalization, about entrepreneurship and individual liberty. He is most known for his book, In Defense of Global Capitalism. He has it right next to him and he's about to show it to you. This book was published in over 20 different countries. And just to tell you in simple words who Johan is the expert you need to listen to, you want to listen to, before you're going to have another one of those debates with socialists who give you Sweden as an example of where socialism allegedly works or worked. So he will refute this myth in just moments. But today we will not only talk about the myth of Swedish socialism, as I mentioned, we will talk a lot about the coronavirus first. Sweden, as you probably know, is one of the very few high-income countries around the world that has not adopted lockdown measures and imposed restrictions on individual liberties to the extent that we see restrictions and limitations around the Western world during the coronavirus pandemic. So how is it really playing out, and what is it maybe in the Swedish DNA or the Swedish history that makes it difficult for this country to restrict individual liberties, and rather what makes it simple for Sweden to go against the stream despite all the international pressure? Johan, welcome, and Boaz, I will just request you. I can hear the doorbell every time somebody joins.
So I'll stop it. One moment.
Just stop the sound from there. And I'll just mention that everyone, please feel free to submit your questions, and you can do it in English, you can do it in Hebrew, I can translate whatever's more comfortable to you. You can send it to Boaz, you can send it in the chat, and we will try to address as many topics as we can. But Johan Norberg, finally, welcome, and take it away.
Thank you very much, Tal, and thanks to all of you who participate here. I'm glad that Sweden is once again the center of the world's attention. It has happened before a couple of times. This time, obviously, the coronavirus situation. It's almost difficult to find time to deal with the pandemic in Sweden because we have to deal with all the international media requests because everybody wants to find out what is going on. But before I go into the discussion about what has happened here in Sweden on that issue, let me refer to what Tal talked about on the history of Sweden as this kind of socialist model, the example of socialism, because that was the last time that Sweden was the center of the world's attention. People were saying in the 1970s and 1980s, and some people still do, that look at Sweden. This seems to be the country that manages to combine with being a wealthy country and a decent country. And they had to keep coming back to Sweden because all their other models ended up with breadlines, devastation, and labor camps. So they returned to Sweden again and again. And some people still do. And they were right for a brief period of time. In the 1970s and 1980s, Sweden had a very large government, highest taxes in the world, regulated everything, businesses in various ways.
What is this?
I'll try to find this guy and take him out.
1 second, I think we have a troll.
There's always someone who wants some attention, right? But
oh wow,
Sweden might be even more interesting. But this happened to be.
Okay, and I'll only unmute you. Okay, Johan, you can continue.
Thank you. This was the brief period in Swedish time when we really became an exception to what other Western market democracies did. And this happens to be the one period in Swedish history when we did much, much worse than everybody else. It's when people look to Sweden and ask, so why is Sweden so rich despite these socialist policies? The answer was, well, like that old joke that you might have heard, how do you end up with a small fortune? Well, you start with a large fortune and then you waste some of it. And that's what Sweden did, because Sweden had had a period of 100 years of very open markets, free trade, a limited government, as late as 1950, lower taxes and less public spending than other European countries and than the United States. Then we got cocky and thought that we're now top of the world, we're the richest country on the planet, let's just begin to spend. And we did. And we began to lag behind other countries substantially. And after 30 years of these policies, we had not created a single net job in the private sector. And after having grown much faster than everybody else, we began to grow 1% less per year than other industrialized countries. So in the 1990s, this ended in a terrible economic crisis, and Sweden got back to the future by beginning to open up markets again, deregulating businesses, privatizing, lowering taxes. And nowadays, when my US socialist friends say that they want the US to be more like Sweden, I tell them, well, in that case, you're going to have to open up for more free product markets, abolish occupational licensing, have more free trade. You would have to reform Social Security, pensions, and introduce individual privatized accounts in Social Security. You would have to introduce competition in the public sector, for example, with a system of school vouchers. And you would have to abolish taxes on wealth, on property, on inheritance, and other things. So whatever Sweden is today, it's not your granddaddy's socialism anymore. And after these reforms, Sweden has also grown faster than other industrialized countries. And that might be a transmission into the discussion about COVID-19, because now suddenly, for some reason, Sweden seems like the last open society, for the reason that Sweden has not done things that other countries have to respond to the pandemic. In a world that closes borders and shuts down societies, Sweden seems to be a place where we're basically sticking to the old recipe, and some think that we're crazy, whereas others think that we have intellectual self-confidence to trust science and our scientific advices even during difficult times. Donald Trump thinks that Sweden is suffering very, very badly, while others, like Denmark's previous Prime Minister, Lars Løkke Rasmussen, thinks that Denmark should have done what Sweden did and trust its citizens. Australia's Prime Minister says that Sweden's policy seems like a death sentence. We have, on the other hand, the World Health Organization saying that Sweden might be the model for other countries to imitate in the future. Who is right? Well, I don't know, and I don't think we can know this yet. I think we'll have to wait months, if not years, to find out what has really happened around the world. But I will tell you what Sweden has done and what the results are so far. So far, Sweden has, unlike its neighbors, we haven't stopped the flights, did not close the borders. We did not implement a state of emergency, no stay-at-home orders. If you're out on the streets, wherever you're going, the police does not stop you and ask you what you're out there doing. Workplaces have not been shut down. We have not closed schools, apart from high schools and universities, and they do distance learning. Sweden has not shut down the restaurants, the bars, the cafes, the gyms, the libraries, the shopping centers, or public transportation. What Sweden has done is the government has recommended social distancing, and specifically to protect the vulnerable, make sure that we do not socialize with people over 70. They've recommended work from home if possible, and to avoid long distance travel if possible. So these are recommendations, not rules and restrictions. But there are some restrictions. No public events with people, with 50 or more people involved can take place, even though spontaneous gatherings of 50 or more cannot be broken up by the police, but no public events like that can take place. We're not at liberty to visit nursing homes for the elderly, and at restaurants and bars, only table service is allowed. You cannot buy your drink at the bar. Those are the major restrictions that we have. But that sets us apart as a very open society, as an open country for the moment. And as our Prime Minister, the Social Democrat Stefan Löfven, puts it, we now have to take responsibility as individuals. We can't ban all harmful behavior. This is not a matter of law, but a matter of common sense and individual responsibility. And that might sound strange if you think that Swedish Social Democrats are the sort of big government, nanny state people who tell us what to do. But as I pointed out in the introduction, they're not the traditional state socialists in every way, at least. They didn't do this because they are classical liberals or libertarians. That's not the reason why Sweden has done this. I think there are 4 reasons why Sweden picked these policy, which sets us so much apart. The first one is that we have a tradition of administrative division of powers, a form of administrative independence that goes back to the 17th century in Sweden, where governmental agencies are fairly independent. The government appoints director generals, those in charge of government authorities, but they're not supposed to tell them what to do. The director general is supposed to follow the rules and the law, but pay attention to the facts and to what the experts within the authority says, not the particular political line that the government has. And that sets us apart from almost every other country, I think, apart from Finland. And that leaves some room for expert decision-making rather than political grandstanding. A government has to show that they're on top of things. They have to show and take people's worries seriously. They can't just stick to the science of it all. Whereas in Sweden, the public health authority, they come up with their advice based on what they think are the data and the scientific expertise. And then obviously the government, they can decide something else, something differently, but we have a tradition of following this advice. And this is interesting when you compare us to some of our neighbors. For example, in Denmark, they shut down their borders to Germans and to Swedes. The public health authorities in Denmark said that there's no scientific reason to do this. This won't protect us in any way, but the politicians did it anyway. In Norway, the public health authority said there are no reasons to shut down the schools. That won't help us, but the politicians did it anyway. In Great Britain, we just learned that the the Prime Minister's advisor, Dominic Cummings, leaned heavily on the supposedly independent scientific advices to tell them, why aren't you suggesting a lockdown of Britain? That would really be helpful if you did it now. And 2 days later, that's exactly what they recommended. In Sweden, the pressure goes in the other direction, from the scientific advices to the government, and that sets us apart. I think the second reason is that we have a tradition of paying close attention to the damage being done to society and to the economy, partly because we had this major financial crisis in the early 1990s that showed us that Sweden isn't invulnerable. We can suffer tremendously, specifically because we're a trade-dependent country. 50% of our GDP is made up of exports. So whenever the world is suffering, we are suffering heavily. And that makes us think twice about the damage we're doing to the domestic economy. Is there any way that we can keep society working and the domestic industries and the service sector alive despite this pain? Well, that would really be helpful. The Social Democrats, the trade unions in Sweden, are by tradition pragmatists. They think about the damage being done to the economy because they know that that's the only way to pay for the welfare state and to keep jobs being created in Sweden. And our Prime Minister is a former trade union boss, boss of the Swedish metal workers trade union. So he knows one or two things about the importance of an economy doing well for people to do well. We know that poverty kills, the horrors that comes with economic depression when it comes to mental problems, to domestic abuse, unemployment, the risk of deaths of despair, and the long-term risks of less investment in new medical technology, in new drugs, in less spending on healthcare in the future. So it's an attempt to think about these things long-term, not just the immediate pain. An attempt to say that we cannot defeat the disease by killing the patient. So the third reason then is that the Swedish politicians and authorities think that we can accomplish some of the benefits of a lockdown without a lockdown. Partly because of a tradition of a high trust culture, a tradition of interpersonal trust. We top the list of when you have gallops on, do you trust people in general to do the right thing, neighbors to do the right thing, governments to do the right thing. Just like for some reason Scandinavian descendants in the United States, those who left Sweden 150 years ago, we seem to trust people in general. And that one of the results is that we tend to follow recommendations from authorities. When they say something, we don't think they do it because of they benefit personally from this, it's just self-service, or they're corrupt. We think that they do it for a reason, and governments trust Swedes to, generally at least, to do the right thing, even though they're not forced to do it. So when they recommend social distancing, they think that people don't want to die and they don't want to expose vulnerable groups for a terrible disease, but they would do this voluntarily. And it seems like this is in most instances working out fairly well in Sweden. An analysis of mobile location data in Sweden show that during the Eastern holiday, by tradition a traveling holiday in Sweden, trips to our favorite holiday spots in Sweden declined by 90%. And I just looked at the data comparing Sweden to Germany, which has a very heavy-handed restriction on mobility, social gatherings, public events, and so on. It seems like Sweden is not that far off from Germany when it comes to a reduction in retail, restaurants, mobility associated with public transportation, and so on. Sweden didn't do it to quite the same extent to Germany, but we're not that far off. which is interesting. Then it means that we are doing social distancing. That is happening in Sweden. And with that, obviously, some pain to the economy is unavoidable because of that as well. But the difference is that this gives more room to local information and to individual needs. If you really have to do something, you can do it without the police asking questions about it. And this, I think, Swedish authorities think also, in a way, makes social distancing more sustainable in Sweden than in other countries. Because if it's too heavy-handed, then people will begin to protest and they will begin to break the rules. Whereas in Sweden, we can break the rules on the margins constantly. And that will also help us then to hopefully to protect those who are most vulnerable. So that's the third reason. Most Swedes seem to abide by social distancing anyway. Not everybody, but it doesn't take everybody. For the fourth reason, and that is that immunity and herd immunity is probably the only way to beat this disease. Swedish authorities thought that what we should do is flatten the curve. Not suppress it, not suppress the disease, because in that case, when we lift the lockdown, we'll see that big peak afterwards, and that will be just as painful then. The key is to flatten the curve, to slow down the spread of the disease, to protect our healthcare system and vulnerable groups. So then if it passes slowly through the population, we will make sure that the healthcare system can have capacity to care for those in needs, but at the same time, it will slowly spread through the population so that we will attain some immunity in a few months. And then even the older segments of population can come out of isolation and we can get back to normal life and get society to work again. Whereas others who are in lockdown, they manage to suppress the disease cases and deaths for now. But the moment they get out of the lockdown, they will probably see a second wave. And if they manage to suppress the disease completely, Australia, New Zealand, for example, then they are going to have to shut the borders to travelers, to business trips for a very, very long time. A vaccine will take at least a year, and it might take even longer. No country can stay under lockdown for that long without ruining society and the economy entirely, and that will kill more people than the disease. In fact, we just heard from our neighbor to the east, Finland, where they worried from the public health authorities that they managed too well in suppressing the disease, that they're not seeing the transmission of the disease that they need to get out of it at some point, because otherwise they don't know how they will ever get out of COVID-19. So those are the four reasons for Sweden's policy. So the question then is, how are we doing? And I think it's important to emphasize that we just don't know. And especially if you compare Sweden to other countries, just don't, because we don't know what's going to happen in Sweden, but specifically we don't know what will happen in other countries as they exit their lockdowns. It takes a long time to evaluate, and also the data that comes out from most countries are difficult to interpret because we're measuring things differently in every country. There are lies, damn lies, and COVID-19 statistics. For example, you might have seen different charts that explains that Sweden is an amazing success story or a horror story. And it's all dependent on which country you compare us to on the chart. We look terrible compared to Denmark and especially Norway, which has done fairly well. But if you instead add countries like France, Belgium, and Britain, or Italy and Spain on the chart, it looks like Sweden is a success story. We look bad if you compare Sweden to the United States, or at least it looks fairly similar, but Sweden looks much better than New York State, which is in a more similar stage of the spread of the virus. So the truth is that we are probably somewhere in the middle. And that's interesting in itself, because that tells you that Sweden is an outlier when it comes to policy, but we're not an outlier when it comes to the outcomes. So, and that tells you something. We also count deaths differently in different countries. Some countries don't count COVID-19 deaths outside of hospitals. When people die at home or in nursing homes, they're just not included in statistics. In Sweden, we have a nosy government, so they want to know who's been naughty and who's been nice. We constantly check the list of people infected against the population register. So anyone who died and had the virus is counted as a COVID-19 death, even if the cause of death might have been a heart attack or cancer. So it's more like they died with the virus rather than died from the virus. Whereas in a country like Norway, our more successful in the short run neighbor, deaths are counted as corona deaths only if the doctor concludes that the virus killed the person in question, and they then report this to the country's public health authority. So I'm sometimes reminded by the old saying, people always and sometimes still think that Sweden is #1 when it comes to suicides in the world. We top the league in killing ourselves. But we're really not when you look at the data. The reason why everybody thought we were is that President Eisenhower of the United States said we did in the 1950s. Oh, Sweden, that's the country where everybody commits suicide all the time. And the reason was that Sweden was the one country that had detailed statistics on suicide, a secular nation where we said that, yeah, if someone jumped off a high-rise building or took a gun to his mouth and shot himself, they probably commit suicide. Whereas other countries, and often more religious societies, said that, oh no, they probably just put the gun to his head by accident. And we still live with that rumor that Sweden was worse just because countries had different ways of counting the number of suicides. New York Times recently had a look at different countries on excess deaths. How many deaths do they have compared to the number of deaths they normally have this week of the year? And it turned out that every country they measured had more excess deaths, many more excess deaths than could be explained by COVID-19 deaths, except one country, and that was Sweden. Sweden actually had an unexplained underestimate of excess deaths of some 50 or 60 deaths compared to what we normally have when you try to explain it by looking at the COVID-19 statistics. So that tells you something about why we shouldn't pay too much attention to those comparisons until we have more detailed data. But however you compare us, I think that Sweden has more deaths than our Nordic neighbors, than Finland, Norway, and Denmark. But that was always a certainty because they suppressed the virus short term through a lockdown. They are now getting out of this lockdown because no society can suppress societies for that long. And then they will see a new wave. So the question is, did they just delay cases, delay those deaths? In that case, did they gain anything, or did they just hurt their societies and their economies? The important question for a Swede to ask ourselves is, did those who die in Sweden short term, would they have survived if they got the virus in 6 months' time or in 12 months' time? And so far, it doesn't look like it. It looks like those who died did not die because the healthcare system was overwhelmed and we had a lack of ventilators or intensive care units. In fact, we always have had an excess capacity of intensive care beds of around 20% in Sweden during this time. And actually, in these last few days, it has increased to an excess capacity of 30%. So we're definitely not anywhere near this kind of exponential increase in cases and deaths that all the models talked about, and that the famous Imperial College models from Britain suggested that Sweden would enter. In fact, we have a big field hospital built recently here in Stockholm with room for hundreds of COVID-19 cases. And the journalists are still waiting outside for the first patients to arrive. But it is still unused because the normal hospitals have been able to ramp up capacity to an extent that has always made sure that capacity was there. The average age of the dead in Sweden of COVID-19 has been 81 years, which is close to our average life expectancy. It is too early to tell what's going to happen in Sweden, but it has started to stabilize. In fact, new patients admitted to intensive care has been stable since March the 23rd for 1.5 months. And it has started to decline as well. And more people now leave intensive care than enter it. And we have a declining number of daily deaths in Sweden. We don't know yet if the models were completely off, but it seems like it. It seems like the models just couldn't understand anything except business as usual or a government-enforced lockdown. The models just didn't understand a change of behavior that's voluntary, social distancing that takes place because people don't want to hurt themselves and others, rather than social distancing because the police would otherwise stop you. It's too early to tell, but so far it seems like we have flattened the curve and that the healthcare system will not be overwhelmed. It might just work out so that Sweden, as one of the first societies, is getting out of this without deaths from a lack of care and getting a herd immunity without ruining society or the economy and therefore human lives in the long run. And in that case, I am guessing that there will be difficult questions to answer for other governments around the world who hurt their societies without gaining any health benefit. My personal view is, to conclude with that, is that I am broadly sympathetic to the Swedish model. Restricting freedoms might be necessary during pandemics if the transmission is sufficiently quick and sufficiently devastating and the mortality rate is high. If you have a real Black Death, a plague like that. But only if we have very good reasons. Only if we know for sure that this will help us. And when we don't know, I think we should stick to what we do know. And what we do know is that we understand for sure the harm that we do to liberties, to societies, and to economies with this very heavy-handed lockdown. And therefore, I think there is an argument for sure for the Swedish version of the Hippocratic Oath, the oldest oath in the medical textbooks. First, do no harm. That is the Swedish way. If you don't know that you will for certain save lives by doing these harms to society, well, the first thing to remember is do no harm. Thank you.
Now I have some questions from the audience. I will.
You were muted, so just started now. Okay, yeah.
Okay,
But, yeah.
so thank you, Johan. At this point, we have a lot of questions. I have a lot of questions here, and please also feel free to submit them to Boaz or here in the chat because he's sending it to me. I just want to continue with the coronavirus and then maybe transition to talking about how to get out of an economic crisis. So one of the questions that we have here is, did Sweden achieve the herd immunity goal? And I would like to add on top of that and ask you, because this is something that I've been asked, Johan, on the Facebook chat, I think. People ask me, why is it too early? You say it's too early to evaluate. We don't have enough accurate data. It will take maybe years, maybe months. But people ask me, why can't we make an interim assessment? Can you explain why an interim assessment doesn't mean much at this point?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very good question. Well, we can make some sort of intermediate assessment, and that's really what I try to do. But we cannot say anything for sure at this stage for two reasons, I think. The first thing is that data gathering and data evaluation is diametrically opposite, or at least dramatically different between various societies. And we need to gather data and evaluate data in the same way everywhere. For example, if someone dies from cancer, but they also have the COVID-19, it's measured as a COVID-19 death in Sweden. It's not in many other countries. We have to have the same way of assessing that before we really know for sure. But the other thing is that every country that tried to suppress the transmission of the disease short term will look good short term because they avoided cases, they avoided deaths. But the moment they begin to open up again, then we'll see a new transmission. They will see a second wave. And then we have to wait for that second wave and possibly a third wave before we understand. Whereas in Sweden, that will not happen because we might attain herd immunity. So yes, we should assess all the time, but we won't know anything for sure for months and even years, I think. And that goes to the second question about herd immunity. Are we getting there? We don't know yet in Sweden because we don't have a sufficient number of antibody tests that show how many have been infected in Sweden. Our public health authority, they say that we might be getting there in a couple of weeks, but that depends on also how you measure it. Does it mean that 50% need to have had it or 60%? Then we will for sure see something that that is close to herd immunity. But even getting close to it might be relevant. And what they've said recently is that they think that we have approached a situation where the R value, the number of people every person infected infects, is probably 1 or smaller than 1. So it seems like we're slowing down the spread of the transmission in Sweden right now. And that is an interesting data point in itself.
I appreciate that you emphasize the aspect that we don't know. It's something that experts and also lawmakers tend to avoid right now because they want to keep the information flowing and show the public as if they have answers to everything. I replied to someone on Facebook just, for example, for this particular question, that it's as if, you know, we were to make an assessment in the middle of the American Civil War right after the Battle of Virginia. So all right, the South has won, you know. It's just too early. We have some more questions here. How does the public feel? And I like this question. Tell us a bit about the public sentiment right now. And is there an opposition, a loud opposition to the Swedish policies?
There is some opposition, definitely. There is a healthy discussion, I should say, in the public, and even among experts. There are different opinions in Sweden. But broadly, I would say that people seem sympathetic to this model. One way of measuring that is to see at look at the political debate. No one is trying to gain anything politically by objecting to this Swedish model. There's some opposition from the Sweden Democrats, the nationalist populist movement in Sweden. They wanted to shut down schools and things like that. But even they are quite quiet for the moment, which suggests to me that they think that there's nothing to be gained by opposing this model right now, at least. And when you look at the polls, the Social Democrats in charge, they just got the biggest monthly gain in the polls that any party has ever had in Swedish political history. They jumped from 24 to 31%, and the prime minister is also increasingly popular, and that also suggests that these are popular policies. Anders Tegnell, who is the man of the hour, the head of the state epidemiologist, who is having these daily press briefings and in a fairly uncharismatic way going through the data. What do we know? What do we think? And please remember to wash your hands. The kind of the opposite of the strong man character in a way, but he is wildly popular when you look at the polls right now. And so it seems like, for the moment at least, Swedes approve of these policies. Obviously that might change, but now the data on cases, on deaths, and on healthcare also seems to be swinging in a healthy direction. So I think that Swedes generally are on board.
I want to move towards talking about, exit strategy right now and how to get out of an economic crisis. Certain states here in the United States, as well as in Israel, my home country, and other European countries are starting gradually to move towards reopening their economies. And Sweden is now also regarded as some sort of a model of how we can continue life almost as normal, but while still maintaining some of these social distancing guidelines. But unlike Sweden, these countries, like here in the US, are either printing or borrowing money to compensate businesses, compensate entire industries, individuals, and families for lost income or jobs lost. Here in the U.S., as all of us know, the Congress has already passed trillions of dollars in unprecedented relief bill, part of the stimulus package. And Sweden, you mentioned it in your intro, is a country that has undergone a financial crisis in the early 1990s. Can you circle back a bit to this and tell us, based on the Swedish experience of an exit strategy out of an economic crisis, what are the do's and do nots in such a situation?
Yeah, that's a very interesting question. And actually, I think that the world has more to learn from our Sweden's 1990s experience of getting out of a crisis rather than this time around, because now we've just tried to sustain ourselves and keep the economy working, whereas everybody else has the problem of trying to start it up again. And that's the challenge, more the challenge that we had in the 1990s. And then I would say that the first thing to learn is that just trying desperately to sustain everything that you did before the crisis might not be the way to get out of it, because the situation when you get out of it will be very different. What consumers demand, the kind of technologies that we need, the kind of businesses that would be economically sustainable might be other ones. So even if it sounds painful, we need restructuring. We need some creative destruction of business models that simply do not work. And the attempt to save any kind of business, any kind of economic activity, or any just expanding consumer demand by splurging liquidity might actually hurt us in the longer run. Because what we need is to transfer capital and labor to the sectors that might be viable in the future. So that is what Sweden did in the 1990s. Expose ourselves to international competition more than ever before, trying to not just sort of take a swim in monetary excess liquidity, but rather trying to look very hard at what do we spend money on and avoid all the things that aren't immediately necessary, and try to then keep this thriving restructuring going. That I think is very important for every country to learn. And the whole thing of just printing money right now, this will come back to haunt us in several different ways, because we will always pay for it. If we're not paying for the debts right now, we will pay for them later, and we'll have to pay them off later. And if it's just an increase in the monetary supply, it'll come back to destroy the wealth that we had before, because that will have to be paid for as well in the longer run. So there are no easy fixes out here. There are no quick fixes. We have to go back to producing the kind of goods and services that are in demand. And if you keep that in mind, I think this will be much easier.
I would like to unmute someone now.
Okay, may I get in. If somebody have a question, he may raise hand, and he will have to open his camera. You're always welcome to open your camera in general, since it will be nicer to see who is speaking, who we are speaking to. And I like to open the mic to Ishai Ilani, okay? If you are, you raise your hand, and if you like to ask something, please feel free to do that. Ishai? Are you with us, Ishai?
Ishai Ilani.
Okay, yeah.
Ishai, yeah, go ahead.
I've been have trouble to unmute. I've asked before about the herd immunity. It's kind of puzzling to me. Why aren't there surveys, random surveys, to find how many people are actually immune? Since these tests are now widely available, they are not expensive. Private companies can do them, and surprisingly, there is no such data. I can't find it, not in Sweden and not in other places.
Yes, that's a very good question, and I agree. And I would say generally that this is one area where Sweden has failed when it comes to testing generally, both for COVID-19, but also for antibody tests to see whether someone had it or not. It has taken us a long time to ramp that up. And it might be that Sweden was a little bit less engaged in doing this. This is just my speculation. Might have been less interested in doing that because we all the time try to keep society open and keep businesses open, whereas it was more important in other places where you could only go back to work if you could show that you already had some immunity against it. I don't know, that's my speculation. It is starting to be done. There are some tests on random segments of the population, and a combination of those tests and some extrapolation looking at other populations suggests that at least in Stockholm, the most the part of the of Sweden that has suffered the most might be around 30% or something like that. But I would take that very cautiously because we just don't know, and it'll take a couple of weeks before they do those tests in a larger scale. And I agree, I don't know why that has not been done yet.
I have another question that Boaz, you sent me this question. What kind of financial aid does the Swedish government provide during this crisis? And I'll add on top of this, are there similar measures like of money printing, bailouts, the kind of which we see in the United States and other European countries?
Yes, I don't think Sweden is that different from most other countries when it comes to that kind of financial help. What they've focused on from the Swedish government side is to try to, in a way, put many businesses that cannot function in some sort of suspended animation, some sort of induced coma, and make sure that they could keep people employed, keep employees on the payroll on a lower wage, and then government pays half of that. Because the assumption is that once the crisis is over, they can rapidly get back on track, and they haven't lost too much of organizational capital to that extent, which it makes sense in many ways to do it like that. However, I think that we might lose some of the restructuring that has to be done when we do that. Apart from that, they're very willing to hand out loans to businesses that are in need, who just have a liquidity problem. And there's generally a very loose monetary policy. We've had a negative interest rate for a very long time, which I don't really approve of, because that has really slowed down the creative destruction of the Swedish economy and created many zombie companies that wouldn't have survived if interest rates were on a more closer to a market rate. So those things have been there. I would say something that separates Sweden from many other countries is that we had a very low public debt going into the crisis. From the left to the right, and I think this is a lesson from the 1990s crisis, we learned not to spend too much during good times, because bad times will come. And that means that that's another reason why I think that Sweden will get out of this in better shape than others, because so many countries, so many European countries and the United States, they've run budget deficits in good times, in the midst of a boom time. And some countries will get close to government bankruptcies when this is all over, I'm sure. Sweden will not.
Yeah. I like to, first of all, this is a lesson we need to learn, because Israel is in general in a good shape, but we worsen it before the crisis, and now we will pay the price. I like to give two of the guests to ask questions. One of them is Zeev. Next after him is Todd. I'll unmute Zeev now. So please, Zeev, feel free to ask or unmute. I'm trying to unmute you. And I'll, okay. Zeev, you are with us. Okay.
Yes, I think actually the question has been asked and answered. Maybe it's about communities where you have stats which are divided into communities. In specific, I mean immigrants and the older age care homes and general population. Just to understand what is the dominant part of the cases and deaths.
Yeah. Good question. And you point to the two areas where we've seen the most cases of excess deaths. First of all, even though I think social distancing has worked generally for those over 70, mostly staying at home and keeping away. But when it comes to nursing homes for the elderly, the disease has entered many of those nursing homes, which seems to suggest that even though you don't have much of a symptom, you can spread the disease anyway. And we have big nursing homes in Sweden as well. So when it enters, it can quickly spread throughout. And I think some 40% of the deaths come from nursing homes. The second one is heavily populated immigrant suburbs of specifically Stockholm, where you see almost a proportion of almost 3 times the number of cases and deaths as we see in other regions of Stockholm. And one reason might be that Sweden has there often a refugee population coming from often Northern Africa, from the Middle East. Socioeconomically, they're much worse off, in worse health originally, and in more overcrowded conditions. So it spreads more in those areas. And I also think that they are not, on average, as much of introverts as other Swedes are. Swedes on general might not spend that much time with their parents and their grandparents, whereas I know this to be the case in many of these immigrant populations, which causes more rapid transmission of the disease.
We'll move to Todd. Todd, I unmute you. You may ask your question, and maybe let us know where you're calling, where you're joining from.
Yes, I'm joining from Austin, Texas. I appreciate the opportunity to present my question. Johan, I really appreciated and enjoyed your film, Sweden Lessons for America, and just presenting the whole picture of Sweden, the good and things that you would like to change. Do you anticipate with COVID and the potential loss of jobs, albeit not nearly to the extent that we're seeing here in America, that the average Swede will say, that there will be pushback on the value-added taxes and some of the other taxes that obviously Sweden, middle-class Swedes pay to a much higher extent than are paid here in America. It's something that politicians on the left conveniently leave out. Do you see more of a push for lower taxation among Swedes with COVID now, or just in general, or do you think that the status quo will be maintained in Sweden from a tax and economic perspective?
Thank you. That's a very good question, and thanks for pitching my documentary. It's actually freely available online if you are interested. Sweden Lessons for America, where for 1 hour I talk about Sweden's history, our economy, how we got rich because of free markets and limited government, how we almost got destroyed because of these 20 years of semi-socialist policies, and how we got back on track. And as you point out, one of the ways in which we have not got back on track is that we still have, on average, very high taxes, and specifically high taxes on poor and middle-income households. Specifically, if you compare it to the United States, much of our tax revenue comes from a value-added tax at 25%, something paid by rich and poor alike on everything or on most things that they buy. Will there be pushback against that and other high taxes in Sweden? I wouldn't be so sure. I think that if Sweden gets out of this without a worse health outcome than others and in better shape economically than others, I think that Swedes in general would just say, increase their trust in the Swedish government generally. And I would assume approve of more of the policies that we have, for good and for ill. Whereas I think that the questioning will be much harsher in other countries around the world. With that being said, whatever happens here, we have entered an economic depression. We will face mass unemployment, and that always creates new and unexpected protests and criticism against the status quo. So anything could happen.
Yeah. Johan, I want to ask you about globalization because you write a lot about this topic. Do you believe that this crisis is going to push us backwards in terms of international cooperation, trade, businesses between companies worldwide? Are you sensing that countries might be moving towards becoming more self-reliant, or maybe on the contrary?
Yeah, I think there is that risk. And in September, I have a new book called Open, the Story of Human Progress, where I talk about how we create progress and destroy progress historically. And it's ominously well timed, unfortunately, because one of the things that I write about is that often in times of crisis, we ruin progress because we become afraid of the rest of the world. We realize how dependent we are on international supply chains and so on. And we build walls and we want strong men to protect us. And unfortunately, what I write about then could be foreign invasions, could be natural disasters, and often pandemics. So that was a little bit scary to write about that history and see it unfolding right now. Often in history, this happens. I think we're beginning to see some of that suspicion between countries, of other nations, and of free trade, because people, they feel uncomfortable realizing that many of the things that we need in healthcare, for example, come from the other side of the world. So perhaps we need more self-sufficiency. I think we will see that trend. I think that will happen. I think countries will begin to have more of industrial policy, governments telling us that these are very important companies, we need them, we need to subsidize them, we need to protect them from the outside world, and we also then need to control them more than before. But as you point out, the other argument can be made, and I think we will also see a strong push against that, because in a way, we are now living in a real world experiment of deglobalization, of a world that is being shut down, where it's just like a kind of a nightmarish version of Greta Thunberg and Donald Trump's idea of people not traveling, no mobility, no immigration, no trade. And it's not that nice. We see that the immediate result is an economic depression and mass unemployment. So why would we want to live with this for the rest of our lives when we're through this pandemic? I think we can see that one obvious argument that I would make is that we need to open up the world again if we want to prosper. And that goes for important medical technology as well. Every country now wants a ventilator industry. How will that work out for you? It'll be incredibly expensive. You don't have the know-how, you don't have the technology, and every ventilator is made up of 500 components. So do you now build 500 factories to produce each and every one of those components? Well, in that case, they will be so expensive and so ill-fitting that you will only afford like one communist era iron lung for your entire population. So that's obviously not the answer to our problems.
So you're talking about the effects or the dangers of this process of deglobalization, but I want to ask you a very similar question, but rather about globalism. Let me just, I think I will have to say it in Hebrew, but because I know that in my home country, sometimes things get lost in translation. Globalism mul globalizacja. There's a difference between the two, globalism and globalization, because we're talking about deglobalization, but at the same time, we have all these concerts promoting one world, one spirit, you know, the effort is shared. And I wanted to ask you, what is this crisis doing to the ideology that we are in one world, free migration ideas? Does it really have a grip in reality besides these very nice concerts?
Yeah, there's an important difference there, and many confuse
them. Maybe you can explain the difference. Yeah, if you can explain it, because in Israel it gets lost by the media all the time. When President Trump speaks at the United Nations in September and he talks about anti-globalism, then Israeli media says, oh, President Trump is against globalization. Just if you can explain.
Yeah, well, as I understand it, globalization means, well, things we are doing across borders. This, what we're doing right now. We're a group from sort of Sweden, Israel, the United States, and so on. That's globalization. People doing things not restricted by the government with others, wherever they happen to be. It's trade, it's mobility, it's communication. That's globalization. But then there's globalism, and I assume from what people tell me about it is that that's the idea that governments are doing things across borders, and specifically they're doing things to standardize this world and to try to come up with some sort of a one world concept from above. And oftentimes people pretend that we who are in favor of globalization is in favor of that sort of one government in charge of everything. But they are obviously different things. That's the technocratic political attempt to sort of standardize and take control of globalization in many cases, I would say, in multilateral institutions, in the United Nations and so on. And some of that might be good, and it might facilitate things, World Trade Organization helping us to keep borders open for goods and services, but it might also be destructive to globalization if it tries to impose a one-size-fits-all on everything. I think one of the great benefits of an open global world is that we can experiment with different solutions and to experiment with different attempts to look at the world and come up to solutions to our problems. And I think that's one of the things that we're learning from this crisis. Not every solution works in every country. It might be dependent on what's the local situation, what's the local culture, what's the healthcare capacity in that place. For example, the Swedish model might not work everywhere. In some places, you might not have the healthcare capacity to deal with COVID-19 cases, and you might need to slow it down and keep it suppressed for a while until you've ramped up that capacity. I don't know, but I think experiments are important to give us more knowledge about what works and what doesn't.
I want to circle back a bit to the economy and go back to what you mentioned before, that social democrats around the world, they often hail Sweden as this paradise of socialism, when in fact, as you said before, socialism almost led to the collapse of your country. And it was the capitalistic approach that eventually got Sweden back on its feet. Now, in the US, you see a similar trend now where people falsely believe that, you know, going out of the Great Depression of 1929, it was FDR's New Deal and jobs programs by the government that allegedly took the US out of the economic crisis. It was in fact something that came much later, you know, a capitalistic policy that came much later, 2 decades after, to be accurate, that took the US out of the crisis. And the US came out of the economic crisis despite the New Deal and the job programs, not thanks to them. Now, you are a historian of ideas, and it's really interesting, I think, maybe if you have an answer to this question, why is the history of economics being taught or remembered in such a distorted manner when it comes to your country, Sweden, but also here in the US? These ideas still prevail.
I think that's because we lost the battle of ideas for a long time. We in the broad liberty movement, classical liberals and free marketeers, we lost out in the debate from the basically 1930s and onwards for a variety of reasons, but specifically because people fell silent and the fence sitters then came down on the wrong side. And people with a statist worldview began to take over the sciences and the universities, and they began to write the textbooks and write the histories about what happened, and they began to erase basically the memory of the classical liberal world that had existed until then. And that, I think, is an important lesson to us all every time, and that battle of ideas is incredibly important, because good things are going on constantly in the world. When individuals are free to adapt their behavior in family lives, in civil society, in businesses, they constantly adapt to new situations and improve the world and come up with new solutions to difficult problems. But the climate of ideas and the cultural atmosphere, the cultural sense of life, as Ayn Rand would have put it, is not always there, because that is being interpreted and broadcasted by intellectuals and secondhand dealers in ideas in various places. And they often have a very distorted view, and often this kind of designer intuition. If something works out, it has to have come from the top. It has to come from President Roosevelt or someone like that, rather than from individuals adapting their behavior to new knowledge. And that just tells us that we have to fight the battle of ideas, because it's not enough just to save the world on the ground. You also have to save the world of ideas.
Johan, I have a question about just about the Swedish currency here, Boaz. People want to, to make investments now. People want to buy foreign currency, Boaz. We have to know if the Swedish currency is the one that we should hold right now. What do you think is going to happen to the Swedish currency compared to other currencies around the world, given the fact that Sweden, as you mentioned, might be printing less money than other countries, might be borrowing less?
Yeah. Good question. And the response is, I have no idea, because the problem is that I used to understand the market, because it was about, if things were going well, the market was going well. That's not the case anymore. Now it's political decisions. It's what the central bank does and the Minister of Finance does. That decides the outcome in the long run. I would bet on Sweden now, I think, compared to many other places around the world at least. But I'm not sure if I can say that with any kind of certainty, because it's suddenly dependent on the central bank, and they might go into an interest rate of in deep negative territory, and they might begin to print money, and in that case, that will definitely ruin it. For a long time, I thought that the stock market was incredibly overvalued, and the Swedish housing market is incredibly overvalued. But on the other hand, where should money go when you just print money and you have this excess liquidity? It has to go somewhere, and it enters then these assets and builds those values. So I just don't know anymore, and I'm a little bit scared.
I like to mention, I think it's suitable to mention Arik Yuan, the person behind Zoom, that we owe him a lot of gratitude nowadays. And we pay the gratitude by multiplying his fortune using Zoom. During the beginning of the Corona outbreak, I talked with a friend and I told him, you know, a good investment nowadays will be on Zoom stocks. And too bad I didn't follow my advice. However, this is also the answer about globalism, immigration, population, and so on. Arik Yuan was born in China, and he tried about 9 times to immigrate to the United States till he finally approved the visa. And he built Zoom company, and now he actually helping the world to recover, to connect, to keep the productivity around the world in a fascinating way. And we actually enjoying it right now. So this is another reminder that behind the relatively good life that we are living nowadays, there is 1,000 of entrepreneurs. We should open the door for them to flourish. Yeah,
that's a very good point, and it's an interesting story. And if I can just add another story to the Zoom one, is that, and the benefit of many eyes looking and many individuals and businesses experimenting rather than one central decision. The price of Zoom on the Nasdaq stock market began to surge in late January. At that time, the collective wisdom of millions of people with their own money at stake began to realize that something is going on with COVID-19. At that point, the strong men of the world, the politicians, they just ignored and thought, no, nothing to see here, no problems, this will just go away. So Nasdaq is smarter than the world's politicians.
Yeah,
Wow.
Hopefully they will not distort it. Yeah.
Yeah. There's that.
Okay, so if there is, Tal, back to you if you want to wrap up.
I have one more question. It comes from home. This question, because Johan, you just mentioned very briefly the housing market in Sweden. We know it's a very, very complicated market. There are a lot of regulations. Why are apartments so expensive, especially where you are right now? In Stockholm, like, don't you have enough land?
This is something that I struggle over every day because I need room for my books. So I need more living space, but it's incredibly expensive in Sweden. There are a couple of reasons for that. One of them being the same thing in every urban hotspot around the world: regulation on building and the supply of, there's plenty of space to build on, and we could build high-rise buildings, but we're just not allowed to. And in that case, when you have an increase in demand, it just pushes prices up. And furthermore, we've also had this loose monetary policy. So we have higher demand, and that goes into housing quite often, but we're not allowed to build anywhere, and then it just gets more expensive. And there's a third reason. We do have, as a remnant of the Second World War, a terrible rent control policy in Sweden, which specifically is quite dramatic here in Stockholm. So half of the supply, I think, of apartments are rental, and there's rent control, which means that if you have that contract, it's basically fixed, and it just increases with some sort of inflation rate, which means that you never ever leave your apartment if you get one. And there's no movement, there's no turnover, and even if you moved away from Stockholm, you keep your apartment for, well, you might go there a weekend once or twice, or you rent it out on the informal market, or just keep your stash of books there, because you never ever want to leave a contract like that. And in that case, the price on other apartments, if you can buy one, shots up even more. And that's a lesson to us all, not just when it comes to the housing market, but keep in mind, this rent control was introduced during the Second World War as a temporary measure. Just now we need this rationing of apartments or this rent control. And then obviously it will go away after the war is over. Well, as far as I understand it, the Second World War is over, but all those temporary government programs, they are still here. So be very worried about what happens during times of crisis, because it could stick around forever.
Yeah.
All right, Johan Norberg, Senior Fellow at the Cato Institute, Swedish author and historian of ideas. Thank you so much for this very fascinating, educating conversation. We now know a lot more about Sweden.
For all the great questions.
Boaz?
Yeah. So thank you, Johan. Thank you, Tal. Thank everybody that joined us to this project. You are welcome to contribute in order to enable more meetings like that, and keeping this running and operating. And I think it's fascinating, and I thank you, Johan, very much. It was a wonderful first meeting, and I hope that many will follow in the future.
Thank you. It was my pleasure, and stay safe and stay sane.